Well, good morning once again. All right, so we're finishing and or continuing and finishing our series on courageous faith, which has been a lot of fun. It's been lots of fun to kind of go through this. To me, when I think of courageous faith, courageous it means strong and set and solid and sturdy. And so when I think of faith when I think of faith, I think of more than just belief. I think of this trusting relationship that we step into with Jesus. That's ultimately what we're talking about as we talk about faith, is this relationship that Jesus offers us as we step into it. So how do we see our faith strengthened? How do we see it become stronger? It's my heart, my desire for myself and for each and every one of us that we have a faith that makes a difference in our lives. That our faith is not just a Sunday faith. Our faith is not just a, hey, I go to church faith. It's not like, I know Jesus, but like that our faith becomes like who we are. Our faith becomes this thing that sustains us throughout the week, in the good times and the bad times. That's what my prayer is, that our faith would become for each and every one of us. And again, when I say faith, think relationship with Jesus. That Jesus would make that kind of difference in your life. Not just for a little while on Sunday, but all throughout your week. And what we've been doing is looking at some of the heroes of the faith in the Old Testament and looking at their stories and kind of what can we glean about what it looks like to be people who have courageous, strong relationship with Jesus. Today I want to expand a little bit this idea of faith with two premises, two things we're going to look at. One is that a courageous faith, and it really does dovetail with what Tim talked about last week, like a courageous faith recognizes that our faith, our relationship with Jesus, is not just about us. That this thing that Jesus has invited us into, this relationship with Him, it's not just about us. It starts here, but that it is meant to flow outward to benefit those around us. That's the first thing I want to make sure, because naturally, we like to think about our faith and our healing and our giftings and what God is doing in our life. That's important. But we don't want to stay there. We want to recognize that He calls us outward, upward towards Jesus and outward towards others. And so we're going to look at that idea. And also that faith lives in the tension between kind of seeing God move and when it's evident that He's moving. It lives in that tension of like seeing it, the kingdom is here and now, and the kingdom is not here yet. I'm not quite seeing what God is doing, right? So faith, and we'll bring this up as we go, is kind of sits in that tension. Yes, God, I see what you're doing. Oh, God, I don't. Where are you? Where are you, Lord? Like faith sits in that tension. And so we're going to look at both of those things. And as we do this morning, what we're going to do is look at, so today is called For Such a Time as This, and you can probably guess what we're going to look at. We're going to look at the life of Esther, which is just an amazing, amazing book. The more I read that this week, I just love the book of Esther. And so we're going to look at some marks of courageous faith that we can learn from and grow from, both in Esther's life, but in her really just the bigger story of Esther. And the book of Esther is an interesting one. It is one of only two books in the Bible that are named for women. The other one being Ruth. Very good. You guys got that. It also is one of only two books in the Bible that do not directly mention the name of God. Another interesting one. What's the other one? Mark knows. Song of Solomon, the other one that does not directly mention the name of God. And so it's kind of interesting. So we see God, maybe not evident, but we see His hand in the midst of it. And so even though we don't see Him, He is present and at work in this book and moving to accomplish His will for His glory and our benefit, for the benefit of His people. It has been well observed that though the name of God be not in it, His finger is. That was one commentator's quote. Even though the name of God is not in it, His finger is all over it from start to finish. We'll kind of pick this out a little bit as the way God is moving almost in the background of this great and amazing story of Esther. And so what we're going to do this morning is look at the book of Esther, her beautiful example of courageous faith, and learn more about what a life for us of courageous faith looks like. And so if we could set the story for the book and set the kind of the context of the book, it's been, we've talked Abraham, and so the kind of the beginning of the Israelites. We skipped Isaac, but then we went to Jacob. And then we bounced forward a little bit in Israel's history to Moses last week. But if we take the story of Moses, that's kind of the story of the Exodus, as God brings his people out of captivity in Egypt and into the desert, we see just after that, let's see, what do we have? We have the desert wanderings as they wander in the desert for those years. And then they finally, Joshua, the book of Joshua tells us the story of how they actually enter into the promised land. Then you get to the book of Judges, as there's just one leader in Israel after another. God raises up judges to kind of free them from bondage to different enemies that come. And then you start getting to the kings. You get to Saul, and then to David, and then to David's son Solomon, as you read through the Old Testament. And then after Solomon, you have this kind of some family strife going on, and where all of a sudden this nation of Israel is divided into two different parts. There's a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. And so then much of the Old Testament follows the two tribes, or the two kingdoms of Israel. Ultimately, we see them in about 741 BC. The northern tribes are defeated and taken into captivity by the Assyrians. So all those tribes in the north are kind of just overtaken by the Assyrians, this world power at the time, and they bring them out into captivity. And then a couple of hundred years later, somewhere around 586, the southern tribes are then defeated by the Babylonians, who were the world power at the time. And so now you've got all of Israel, all of God's people, brought into captivity. And so there's even, as we've talked about, the tension of the promise. Where's the promise going to come from? How is God going to rescue his people in this mess that they're in? Well, after being in captivity for some years, 70 or so years, we read the king of Persia, who's now the world power. It was the Assyrians and the Babylonians and then the Persians. The king of Persia, Cyrus, allows the people to return to Jerusalem, to begin to rebuild the temple and to begin to rebuild Jerusalem. This is... Actually, I don't have the year in there. But the books of Ezra and Nehemiah describe these events. And so again, if you're skimming through your Old Testament, you'll see the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. And somewhere in the midst of this time, somewhere around 474 BC, the events of the book of Esther occur. And so Cyrus, this Persian king, lets them go back, and then about 150 years later, we have this book of Esther. And so you have some of the Israelites are back in Jerusalem, starting to rebuild the temple and starting to get kind of life going again of what it looks like to be Jewish. And you've got some that are still in captivity, that are living amongst the nations around them, Persia specifically. And so that's the setting for the book. I always think the setting is important, as we realize as we read it. But let's see. So what I thought we'd also do is just take a zoom through. There's definitely some verses that I want to focus on. But this book is just it is like a Hollywood movie. It is so amazing. And so let's just take a little zoom, a 5,000 feet tour of the book of Esther. Now, I'm going to just skip around. They're not going to come up on the screen, so you can kind of just try to catch up with me, or I'm just going to read it. So you've got this king over Persia, I'm going to read his name once, and then I'm going to call him king after that. And so it's King Ahasuerus. There you go. And so we're just going to call him king. So he's the king of Persia. And so he's sitting on his throne. He's got this huge kingdom, 127 provinces that he rules over. And he says, you know what? I am going to have an amazing feast. And so he throws this rockin' party for it's 6 months. This is 128 days or something like that. I think I did the math right. 180 days, which I think is like half a year. And so he throws this huge party to celebrate the extravagance of his kingdom and the wealth of his kingdom and the abundance of his kingdom. And he's bringing in the midst of those days different leaders and rulers from all the provinces, and he's wining them and dining them. And then I thought verse 8 in chapter 1 was interesting. It says, and drinking was according to this edict. There is no compulsion, for the king had given orders to all the staff of his palace to do as each man desired. So in other words, it was a rockin' party. Just drink and eat and be merry and lose your card. Right on you can hang on to that for now, Jake. And so here's the scene, right? They're partying hardy at the palace table. And it says, on the seventh day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, it says he commanded his servants to bring Queen Vashti, his wife, before the king with her royal crown in order to show the people and the princes her beauty, for she was lovely to look at. And so in the midst of this, this crazy party, he says, you know what? Let me just show off my wife. My kingdom is amazing and all the riches. Let me just amaze everybody with my wife and her beauty. Come on out, wife. And Queen Vashti's like, no, I don't think so. I am not your party toy, and I'm not just going to come out and prance in front of everybody. It's not going to be that way. And so she says no. And, that didn't go over so well. It says, at this, the king became enraged, and his anger burned within him. And you can imagine, of course, the king of the known world who has everything, and whatever he wants happens. At his point, somebody could be put to death. This guy was supreme ruler. And so for his wife to tell him no was a big deal. And so he says he burns with anger, and then he gets his wise men around him, and he says, what should I do? And their response basically was, which is almost laughable, but he says, not only has the queen done wrong against the king, but also against all the officials and all the peoples who are in the provinces of the king. For the queen's behavior will be made known to all women, causing them to look at their husbands with contempt, since they will say the king commanded the queen to be brought before him, and she didn't come. And so they blow this whole thing out of proportion. His wise men, oh my goodness, because your queen wouldn't do it, it's going to affect all the husbands. We got to do something about this. So this is what we say: make an edict that the queen will never again step before the king, and you get to pick another queen, the one that's better than her. And so that's the advice they give him, basically. And so that's what he does. And so letters were written to all the provinces with the... I jumped ahead. My page moved. But there were letters written, and they did send them to all the provinces, that the queen would no longer... it was written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, so that it would never be repealed, that Vashti is never again to come before the king. And let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. And the idea here in Persia is that when an edict was written, and this will kind of come back later, it couldn't be repealed. Like once the king said it, it couldn't be changed. Chapter 2 then starts, after these things, when the anger of the king had abated, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed against her. The idea here is that he's not angry anymore, and actually he remembers that oh my goodness, I love my wife, and she was amazing. And so it says, but the king's young men who attended to him said, let beautiful young virgins be sought out for the king. In other words, these were the smart folks that said, just have her kicked out of here. They're worried now if he brings her back, she's going to have them put to death. Wait a minute, you told the king to get rid of me? I'm back in business and you're out of here. So they say, don't think about her anymore. You know what we'll do? We'll go throughout all the provinces and we'll get the most beautiful young women and we'll bring them in here, and you can pick the one you like the best to be the queen. And that's what they did. And so there was... let's see, it says, and a new character is introduced. It says, now there was a Jew in Susa, where the citadel, where the king lived, whose name was Mordecai. And so you're introduced to this guy, Mordecai, who was taking care of and bringing up a young lady named Hadassah, which is, of course, Esther. That was her Hebrew name, the daughter of his uncle, for her father and mother had passed away at this time. And it says the young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at. And so Esther is this beautiful young woman. We start to see, though, now God's hand in the midst of her life. Again, we don't see God written about, we don't see God mentioned, but you're going to see favor after favor after favor in her life, almost like Joseph when he was in captivity, and God just keeps showing him favor. It was the same thing for Esther. And so Esther was taken into the king's palace and put in custody of this guy Haggai, who was in charge of the women. And it says the young woman pleased him and won his favor. And he quickly, he became her favorite. And he took care of her and gave her the best of everything and gave her the best servants. And so she's winning favor, even though, it seems like almost a good thing to be picked. It really wasn't the best thing in the world to be picked as a part of the king's harem. Because if he didn't pick you as his queen, you were stuck forever, without the possibility of marrying somebody else. It was really like a death sentence, really. Your freedom was gone if you were picked as one of these ladies, but the king didn't pick you. And so it really wasn't, it sounds like a good thing. It really wasn't that these guys were picked. So it was a hard time in her life, I'm sure. And so it says that, but it says Esther had not made known to the people that they were Jewish. Mordecai said, don't talk about your background and your Jewish heritage. And it says that later on now in chapter 2, Esther was winning favor in the eyes of all who saw her. And basically, she comes into the king says, she's the one. She's amazing. I love her. Let me marry her. And he gives her, sets the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Sometime later, so you've got now, she kind of gets drafted into this terrible beauty contest. God shows her favor. The king actually picks her. And some years later, Mordecai runs across something. Mordecai now, who has, it says he's hanging out at the king's gate. That's kind of where government was done. And so it looks like Mordecai might actually now, because his niece is the king's wife, he's got a little bit of a position. Maybe he's a politician at this point. He gets wind that there's plot to kill the king. He gets wind of it, and he tells his niece, he tells Esther, hey, let the king know that these two guys are going to try to kill him. And so it came to the knowledge of Mordecai. He tells the queen to tell the king. When the affair was investigated and found to be so, the men were both hanged on the gallows, and it was recorded in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. And so he rescues the king, and the king makes sure it's marked down in the book. It was written that this Mordecai saved his life. Another foreshadowing event, so remember that one. So it's recorded, but nothing is done to celebrate it. Chapter 3, it gets deeper. There's another character that's introduced here, this character of Haman. Haman's the evil character, right? Haman is the one who's he's one of the king's top lieutenants. He's one of the highest-ranking officials with the king, and there's an edict where, because Haman loved power, he loved prestige, and so there was an edict that said, like, whenever Haman walks by, like, people have to bow down to him and show him honor and respect. But who wouldn't do it? Kind of like Daniel when he was taken into captivity. Who wouldn't do it? Mordecai, right? As a good Jew, right? He would not bow down to anyone but God. And so it enraged Haman that this Mordecai dude would not bow down to him. Everybody else showed him respect and honor, but not this Mordecai. And it enraged him so much that he didn't want to just get back at Mordecai. He found out that Mordecai was Jewish. He wants to wipe out all of the Jews that are in the provinces. It's going to be a Holocaust. And so he goes before the king and he says, King, what should we do with these people who won't, follow your rules? And the king says, listen, it's up to you. You do what you want. And so Mordecai puts out this edict that in about 6 months later, that all the Jews were to be destroyed. He was going to give him 10,000 talents of silver to the king if he would let him do this. And so letters were sent out with instructions to destroy and to kill and to annihilate all Jews, young and old, women and children, in one day, the 13th day of the 12th month. Not a good time for God's people in the midst of captivity. And so Mordecai gets word of it. He tears his clothes and puts on sackcloth and ashes and went out in the midst of the city, and he cried out with a loud and bitter cry, like, what is going on here, Lord? Save us. Of course, God's name is not mentioned. And then Mordecai gets word to Esther about this thing. Esther, do you know what's going to happen? And so he explains it to her, and he commands her to go to the king to beg his favor and to plead with him on behalf of her people. It says, then Esther gets word back to Mordecai. She says, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law, to be put to death. Right? And she says, I can't just barge in there and tell him this is going on and do something about it. If I walk in to see the king without being invited, I am a dead woman. You saw what he did to his last wife when she didn't come in when she was told. And she says, but as for me, I haven't been called to come into the king in like a month. And he's almost like forgotten about me. So let me pause it right there for a second. So that's the lead up. So you've got this crazy story going on where Esther is elevated to be the queen, this nobody really, and God's favor is upon her, and she's picked as queen. You've got this amazing, horrible plot to just wipe out the Jews. And then Mordecai saying, hey, you've got to do something about this thing. She says, I can't. What am I supposed to do? He'll kill me if I just go. And so before we read these key verses, these next one, I just want to remind us of the first point that I had tried to make, was that our faith is not just about us, right? That our faith, this relationship that we have with Jesus, for her, this part of being Jewish and having God as her God was not just about her. It's not just about us. 2 Corinthians 5:17 through 19 says that, therefore, if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. The old has passed away. Behold, the new has come. I love that verse. I feel like I read that all the time. That's the first verse I ever memorized. And so when we step into faith in Jesus, we are brand spanking new, right? We're not just better versions of ourselves. We are completely new from the core of us. Faith in Jesus is a supernatural event. We are, spiritually speaking, completely new creatures. But it goes on to say then, all of this new relationship through faith in Jesus is from God, who through Christ reconciled us to himself and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. That is, in Christ, God was reconciling the world to himself, not counting their trespasses against them, and entrusting to us this message of reconciliation. And so this verse kind of reminds us that as we step into faith in Jesus, it's not just about us, that he invites us into his story. He invites us into what he's doing in the world, and that we now get to play a role in seeing other people blessed. We get to see other people come to know Jesus through our own faith. And so faith means reaching up to Jesus, and it also means reaching out to others, right? And so that's something we have to remind ourselves. And so what do we have? We have Esther. Now it says, in verse 12, so it says, and they told Mordecai what Esther said, and Mordecai tells them, do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than the other Jews. Don't think that if you don't say anything that you're going to escape, because you're going to get killed just like everybody else. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. Like what God is going to do is going to happen regardless, whether you take part in it or not. He'll just do it a different way. But you and your father's house will perish. And here's that great line. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. And then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, go, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa, hold a fast on my behalf, and do not eat or drink for 3 days. I and my young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it's against the law, and if I perish, I perish. Great verses and great lines. And so we see, in this idea that our faith is not just about us. Courageous faith sees life as part of God's unfolding plan. And so a courageous faith sees our life and the life that we lead as part of what God is doing in the world around us. And who knows, Mordecai said, whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. Do you see your life in this way? Right? Can you see your life in this way? That maybe all the things that have happened to you in your life from the day you were born to where you find yourself right now was not God's working and God's doing to place you right where you're at. If you think of Esther, it hadn't been all easy. She lost both her parents. They're Jews living in captivity. She's now been taken to the king, and it's just, life is not always easy for her, right? So it's not just the good stuff that God is working in. It's the difficult stuff as well. Can you see your life that way? Like, what time is it in your life that where God has placed you? I think in a bigger sense as a nation, right? It's a time in our nation's history where it seems like less and less acceptable to be a Christian. You hear story after story about where, you can't pray in school, or you can't do this, or you can't do that, right? It's a dark time. What is He doing in your life now that's meant to bring life to others around you, maybe just large sense? But what time is it in your family's life? What time is it in your work life? What time is it in your friend's life, right? What's going on in your life right now? And can you see it more than just this is what's happening, and see it more of like, hey, God has placed me here, a person of faith, a person who carries the Holy Spirit, right? Because you are there, the presence of God is there. And so can you see the ins and the outs of your life, the people that you sit next to at school, the people who you work with right now, the people that you run into at the store, as part of God's plan? It's His plan that you are there. It's His plan that you work with who you do. It's His plan that you're friends with this person during this hard time of their life. Can you see your life in that sense? And then just be open, right? Again, last week's, all right, Holy Spirit, what are you doing? How do I show God's light? How do I step out into this person's life? How do I benefit them? What time is it in your life? Can you see through the eyes of faith that where you are is not an accident? Where you are right now is not an accident. God is at work, which really does lead us to the next point too, is that, well, no, it actually doesn't, but where's my next point? Courageous faith increasingly dies to self. So courageous faith kind of sees that we've been placed in this moment for a specific reason, that God is at work. But a courageous faith also increasingly dies to self. I love that line where she's like, listen, be praying for me and fast for me, and I'm going to be praying and fasting, but I'm going to go in, or I'm going to do this thing. I'm going to go in and talk to the king. And if I die, I die. So be it. Courageous faith is one that I think increasingly dies to self. We've been called to die to our old way of life and to rise into a new life. Courageous faith is one that more and more sees things like, remember John the Baptist? They come to him and they, Jesus is baptizing all these people. What do you think about that? And John's like, listen, he must increase and I must decrease. And so, like, how do we develop that in our lives? Is to just say more, because we think we know what's best in our life. We know what we're supposed to do. We know the way to do things. But how can we more and more say, you know what, God, let me just die to that old stuff. Let me die to my passions and my pursuits and just say, what are you looking to do? How do I say yes to you in deeper and deeper ways? And as we do so, let me just affirm this, as that we let go of our things and give them to God, we think we're going to miss out. I think I say this a lot. We feel like we're going to miss out. Oh my goodness, like if I don't pursue this thing, how is it going to happen? But when we give things over to God, right, seek first the kingdom of God, and then all this other stuff will be added to you. When we say, not my will be done, but yours, Lord, we actually find out that things go better, right? The things that we were pursuing, the things that we were trying to do with our own strength and our own power and our own energy and our own wisdom, we find that they actually just seem to happen better when we say, your will, God, not my own. Dietrich Bonhoeffer famously said, when Christ calls a man, he bids him to come and die. To die to self and to live with Christ. Galatians 2:20, right? I've been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. And so rather than simply going through our days and lives, chasing our own plans and purposes, can you make room for God's plans and purposes to be central in your life? And I'm going to do this fast because we have a little special thing at the end here. And so the queen goes in. She tells the king and finds favor with him. He actually sees her and is delighted that he sees her again. Come on in. Tell me what's going on. And she tells him about this plot by Haman. And so what is it? She tells him, he says, listen, I'll give you whatever you want, up to half of my kingdom. And she says, listen, just do this. Just throw a party for me. Right, just throw a party for me if I found favor in your eyes. Now, in the midst of this, let's tell a quick story too. So Haman now is going to plot to hang Mordecai. Haman has had it with Mordecai. He's going to build these gigantic gallows to hang him on, so that this is in the works behind the scenes. He's going to just hang Mordecai. But get this, in chapter 6, so she's told the king about this. Actually, no, she hasn't told the king yet, but she's about to. So she hasn't told the king yet. She goes, listen, just let me have a party, and then at the party she's going to tell him about this plot. And so she hasn't, but she's talked to the king already. But chapter 6, it goes, on that night, the king couldn't sleep. Now just keep this in mind too, by the way. We think everything is a coincidence. There's what is it, a God incidence? Right? So this is God working behind the scenes. It looks like maybe he just couldn't sleep. But really, I think what's going on is that God is directing this thing. And so it says he can't sleep. And so the king gives orders to bring the book of memorable deeds, the Chronicles, and they were read to the king. The king can't sleep. He could have ordered anything to come to his room. He had a harem of women. He could have had somebody play music, the best musicians in the world. They could have come in. Literally anything he could have done. He could have decided to take a trip. This guy could do anything. But what does he have done? Bring me a book to read. And not just any book. The book of the Chronicles, the books that kind of tell about my reign. And it says, it was found written how Mordecai had told about the two that were going to kill the king these years before. So it says, and the king said, what honor or distinction has been bestowed on Mordecai for this? And they're basically like, nothing. We didn't do anything for Mordecai. And the king's like, oh my goodness, we gotta honor this guy. He saved my life. Like this is like, I don't have it written. It might be like 10 years after the fact. Out of the blue, he can't sleep. He orders a book, right? You don't see God's name mentioned. It doesn't say God didn't call him. God woke him up and shook him, and God said, "Pick this book." It's not written that way. But God is going on behind the scenes. God is directing all this stuff. And then here's the kind of the cool stuff. And so, the king brings in Haman, and he's like, hey, what would I do if I wanted to honor somebody? And Haman comes up to this, because Haman thinks it's him. Oh, he's going to honor me. This is great. Oh, so you should do this. And you do all this stuff. Meanwhile, he's like, all right, that's awesome. All that stuff you said, do it to Mordecai, right? Put the stuff on him and march them out and bless him. And he's like, oh my goodness, I've got to honor this one who I want to kill. And of course, the turn of events is that Haman is hanged instead of Mordecai. But courageous faith, another thing that I wanted to bring out, is that even when we don't see God moving, courageous faith recognizes that he still is. Hebrews 11:1, right? Faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the convictions of things not seen. That's why it's called faith. If you saw it with your own eyes, it doesn't take much faith to believe it, right? Faith doesn't see it, yet still believes it and recognizes it's happening. And so can we see in the midst of our lives, just as we see in this book, that it might not be obviously God, or, he doesn't put a neon sign and say, hey, this is what I'm doing. Can we see God at work in the midst of our lives, even when it's not going well, even when it's going difficult, right? Can we see God still moving to accomplish his purposes? Because that's exactly what she's doing, what he is doing. God can direct things according to his purposes. And so those are the 3 points that I want to hit really quick, because I want to save time. And so these two things, this idea that faith is not just about us, and faith sees God moving even when he's not evidently moving, and really kind of against the grain. Because we like to think, again, our faith is about us, and we like to think like God is only working when we see him working. So it's a little against the grain, both of these things. We see coincidences, not God's hand, very often, right? Like seeing is believing. So we think there's a lot of coincidences going on, but actually it's God's hand. But Jesus, this is why we need Jesus. Jesus, the one who says, I didn't come to be served, but to serve, and to give my life a ransom for many. Jesus is the one who came to display what life in faith relationship with God looks like. That it wasn't just about him, it was about what God was doing in the world. That's why we need Jesus as our model, the one who will break us out of ourselves and say, yes, it's not just about me, Jesus. Like you, help me to live my life for others. Jesus, the one who recognized that, God would say, Jesus would say, the Father shows me all things, right? My Father is still at work to this moment. Jesus always saw God working and the Spirit moving in the midst of things, right? Can we do that in ever-increasing ways? What are you doing in this moment, Father? How do I see what you're doing in this moment that doesn't seem like you're evidently moving? How do I do it? It's why we need Jesus. As I riff here just for a second, do we have our next band handy and ready? Jeff, you good? All right, and where's Kaylee? And so what we thought we would do is have two young folks come up and kind of play a song for us as we transition into ministry time, which is going to be a real blessing.
¿Dónde te encuentras? Olvidando de lo que estás pasando, tu inocencia ha sido robada y tu confianza quebrada. Escucho tu desesperación. Auxilio, ayúdame. Te defenderé siempre y nunca solo peleas. Creo que te rescataré. No hay distancia separe o te deje indefenso, seré tu escudo, seré tu resguardo en todo momento. Escucho tu desesperación, auxilio, ayúdame. Darkest night, it's true, I will rescue you. to reach you in the middle of the hardest fight. It's true, I will rescue you. I hear the whisper underneath your breath. I hear you whisper you have nothing left. I will send out an army to find you in the middle of the darkest night. It's true.